Okay, so let me set the scene. Welcome, Martin. Thank you for joining us today to speak on a very important topic to do with loneliness in middle-aged men. In my preparation, as I've begun to look at this over the last few weeks, have read quite a bit of material. And a recent poll by YouGov found around 1 in 5 men in the UK claim to have no close friends, twice as many as the percentage for women. Another poll by Charity Age UK, meanwhile, showed a 50% rise in the number of men admitting to feelings of loneliness in the past decade. So, having set the scene, Martin, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you very much for asking me to talk to you. The title of this talk that Paul offered me was the biggest threat facing middle-aged men is loneliness. It's probably appropriate, and not just a lawyer's characteristic, to just think about some definitions there. First of all, middle-aged. I have lots of friends well into their 60s who are apt to describe themselves as middle-aged, to which my response is that I don't know many people of 120. But for these purposes, we'll generously interpret middle age as anything you like between sort of 30-ish and 70. And then in terms of loneliness, there are lots of definitions of loneliness, but a combined one that I've lighted on is the feeling that arises, and it's perhaps an unpleasant feeling that arises about the gap between a person's desired level of social contact and the actual level, and it engages with the perceived quality of relationships. What it's not about is solitude or simply being alone. So loneliness and solitude or solitariness, sometimes people seek that, sometimes we're encouraged as Christian men to seek it, aren't we? Periods of quiet alone. And loneliness is to be distinguished from simply solitude. And it's not about having lots of people around you, simply being, as it were, among a lot of people. You can be, as I'm sure you have appreciated, you can be very lonely in a crowd. Let me then, as a starting point, just remind you of what's often referred to in marriage ceremonies, that verse from Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, where God says it's not good for man to be alone. And as a consequence of that statement, God created women. And it's important to see that he created women in order to provide a companion. So the basic premise was it's not good for man to be alone, or if you like, it's not good for men to be lonely. A simple question: is God right? Is that right? I'm going to start with a slightly shocking statistic, and it's a very serious topic, and it comes with a health warning that if it touches you, then I encourage you please to very obviously get hold of somebody to talk it through. But some of you may know already that the biggest single cause of death in men under 50 is suicide. Men are between 4 and 5 times more likely than women to take their own lives. And that's a statistic which applies across the age groups. A study by the Samaritans from which those statistics are taken, a study which was conducted by 5 leading social scientists gathered from around the United Kingdom, looked into the reasons why that might be so. Why is that such a predominant cause of death, and why are men much more likely than women to be so afflicted? Now, I just draw attention to 2 of their conclusions and 2 of their findings. The first was that beyond the age of 30, men have fewer supportive peer relationships than women, and are often dependent on a female partner for emotional support. So fewer supportive peer relationships post 30. And secondly, they said that we need to recognize that for men in midlife, loneliness is and I quote, very significant cause of their high risk of suicide. There is, they said, a need to enable men to strengthen social relationships. In addition to those statistics taken from that Samaritans report, Paul has reminded you of what came out of an ONS survey. Other surveys and studies undertaken have highlighted a significant risk of increased cardiovascular disease and other health conditions, very significant and statistically significant links between loneliness and those conditions. So, surprise, surprise, God is right. It is not good for men to be lonely. Others have recognized that, haven't they, over the years? Whoever devised solitary confinement as a form of punishment and torture appreciated, didn't they, that making people or forcing people to be alone, to be lonely, was a form of torture. So where are we now here in the United Kingdom? We're in what I think I can still safely describe as a post-Thatcher era. We still have a very powerful imperative related to individualism, individual achievement, being independent, with the significant impacts on what it means to be successful, particularly to be successful as men. For men particularly, the Samaritans found what their report describes as a gold standard of masculinity that was in operation. Men concerned to achieve what they regarded as a gold standard of masculinity, which was prizing power, control, a sort of invincibility. And in that context, having a job and providing for their family was central for men. And the achievement of that gold standard, something which trumped relationships or indeed their own emotional health. I have to say that in that connection, evangelical Christianity hasn't, in many traditions, very much to offer men beyond what the world offers. In many evangelical traditions, we have our own version of the gold standard of masculinity, which is a kind of victorious Christian living in which the answer to every question of how are you is I'm fine. And you only discover so often in the church, we only discover that someone isn't fine when they say to us, well, actually, the last 6 months have been really rough. I'm over it now, but it's been really rough and I've had a really hard time. Or we only discover that something's really not been right when something more tragic happens, or there is some significant and very obvious breakdown. So the Christian gold standard is often, I have to say, not much better than the one the world offers. The practical causes of loneliness. In looking at this, there's a need to bear in mind that what we're talking about is not whether you've got lots of mates or lots of chums. What we're talking about is the quality of your relationships, not the quantity of them. It's the quality of the connections in the relationships which makes the difference between being lonely or being in a position where you can say, no, I'm not lonely. And if I am even drifting towards it, I know that I've got people that I can ring and say, hey, come and chew the fat with me or chew the fat online with me. So it's not about the numbers of friends, it's about the quality of the relationship. And the problem with that is very simple, isn't it? That quality relationships demand time, and time is often what in middle age, at least, for working men, they have not got a lot of. So they have time pressures, very obvious time pressures in middle age of job, home, family, trying to keep up with a constant stream of email traffic in the pandemic world, trying to keep up with a constant stream of Zoom meetings, time pressures, and what gives way in those circumstances for men, because they're often consciously or unconsciously aiming for that gold standard of success. What gives way is time with friends and time to develop quality relationships. Secondly, there is that feeling, isn't there, which certainly I can recognize in myself, the feeling that, well, everyone else seems to be fine. It's just me. Everyone else is fine. I'm the one who seems to have the problem. And in that connection, one of the significant things that has emerged from some studies is the connection between people who have a history of loss or trauma, been subject to harsh parenting. They are the people who are often identified as being especially vulnerable to feelings of loneliness and to being acutely impacted. So just let me repeat that. Histories of loss, trauma, harsh parenting. Those are issues I'll come back to in a moment in a slightly different context. Thirdly, there is the fear of others and the opinion of others, the appearance of being weak, can't hack it, can't keep it together. And that is a powerful imperative. At least I make my own confession that in middle age, between 40 and 60 or 40 and 55, keeping it together and not appearing to be, in inverted commas, emotionally weak was a consideration that would have impacted on my relationships. The feeling that I should be able to cope. What's wrong with me? It's only me. All these other people around me appear to be coping perfectly well. Next, what do we do about this stuff? What might we practically do in order to address some of these things? From my own point of view, I have to say that the key issue is to be rooted in Christ, to know who I am in Christ, that I am loved, cherished, valued, accepted as a precious son of God, and to not just to have that as something which I know because it's in my head and I've heard it preached on, but to know that in the very guts of my being, that is the truth about me, not some pasted up text which sits over the doorway or whatever in church. And if you even suspect that is so for me, you have any suspicion about any element of that, then that is something that is to be got to grips with, isn't it? Secondly, the roadblocks that need clearing on the way to that, on the way to emotional health. There are obvious ones, and I'm sure you'll be familiar with them, but among them would be unforgiveness, those things I was referring to earlier, those traumas of the past, those broken relationships, those things that when you think about them, they just slightly churn your stomach or give you troubled thoughts. They make you feel different or isolated. You think of yourself as being different from others around you. No one else has experienced what I've had to go through. No one else has had this sort of problem. And so we isolate ourselves in that sort of difference. And the answer, of course, is that is the enemy of your soul's tactic. If I can get met, there is no more vulnerable place for men to be than to be alone. And that is alone, emotionally isolated, no more vulnerable place to be. And the simple test with those things from the past is that which I've just referred to. If they trouble you, they are a recurring thought, they turn you slightly in your stomach, they are things to deal with. The third thing is a very obvious thing, isn't it? And those are the undealt with things that we would call, in straightforward terms, sin, undealt with sin. And why is that? Why does that matter in the context of emotional health? Well, it matters because sin is very undermining for our sense of self-worth. We're not good, generally speaking, at open confession in the church. So we've got these things which we do, which no one else knows about. And if we don't take them to God and deal with them, then we undermine our sense of value. We become conscious of hypocrisy in ourselves, and it undermines us emotionally. It undermines our ability to relate properly to other people, because we think if they really knew us, if they knew what the things that I do and no one else sees, they would not want to know me. And so we're undermined in our relationships and in our ability to make good relationships. It saps our confidence and creates for us the ideal position in which to feel isolated or alone. The fourth thing then, so deal with those things, deal with the sin, get to God with it, wipe the slate clean, make sure that it's dealt with. But the fourth thing is perhaps, in a sense, the most obvious, and that is get a friend for the journey. Get someone, and it's a question which it seems to me we all need to ask ourselves, is who is there who I have given the permission to, given the right to speak into my life and to ask me questions which I am bound to answer honestly when they pose them? Who is there in that position to whom I will answer honestly, and who has given me that sort of companionship? You will recollect, no doubt, many of you, that Methodists early on in the life of the Methodist Church, Wesley very wisely decided that one of the ways he would build his Christian communities was by encouraging men to get together, to sit round in a small group and to make their confession to one another. Imagine doing that in a modern day church, All right, chaps, we're going to have a home group. There'll be 6 of us. We're going to sit round and we're going to confess the errors of our week, the week to one another, and pray for one another. And in fact, though Wesley would not have known it, but in fact, studies show generally that is one of the most emotionally healthy things for men to do, and one of the best ways in which men make any sort of real bond with one another is when they share the reality of their lives with one another, rather than sharing the carefully curated version which is on your Facebook page or your Twitter feed or Instagram, whatever you happen to do. And it really is important, isn't it? It's one of the reasons why Freemasonry continues to prosper in relative terms, is because it provides men with an opportunity to be committed to one another, because it's a requirement of the way the lodge works, to be committed to one another, to be entirely confidential, and to, in a way, to be ready to lay down their lives in order to help one another. And we poorly replicate it, I have to say. In my experience, we poorly replicate that in the church. We do not provide for men, generally speaking, that opportunity to feel that they are cared for in that way. And we don't encourage, I think, enough that Methodist way of saying, well, who is there around? And no doubt all of you will say, oh no, I've got people in my life who do that for me. And I do that regularly, and I make sure that I prosper in that relationship. You'll remember, and Graham Hutt has the verse, I think, engraved somewhere on his desk, Proverbs 27:17, as iron sharpens iron, one man sharpens another. It's a rather hard sort of sense, isn't it? But the message is clear, isn't it? We are to be there for one another. Sharpening is perhaps, as I said, rather a hard, if you'll forgive the pun, hard-edged way of putting it. But we are to be there for one another, sharpening one another, caring for one another. And we can only do that if we set out to prosper the relationships and the relationship opportunities that God provides us with. And that involves, for all of us, not waiting for someone to ring us, not waiting for someone to contact us. It involves us, doesn't it? Actually moving out towards people and being willing to take that risk. And in that way, to enjoy what God intends for us, that is, that we should not be alone, that we should not be lonely.